sometimes think we misunderstand Donald Trump and the way his administration works. His detractors criticize him and his supporters love him because he's not a politician. He comes from outside the system. He wasn't brought up on these established global rules. He doesn't care for them. Actually, he disdains them. But while he's not a politician, he's absolutely a showman. He was far more familiar with a television studio than with the halls of American power before he made his astonishing path to the White House. Trump is brash and impulsive, we know that. As he himself said during that row in the White House just last week with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, this is going to make great television. Yet that great television is being seen and interpreted by people around the world. I think there's a tendency to imagine that so many of his administration's policies are as a result of that impulsiveness, which established minds and establishment minds might argue is better suited to television than politics. His unwillingness to back Ukraine, they would say, is due in significant part to his personal dislike of Zelensky. But what if there's a more strategic element to that brash, public-facing act? We had a fascinating piece in the magazine recently by Alex Hobson titled "The Humiliation is the Point." I brought Alex onto the podcast to discuss his ideas in that essay. You'll hear him as my first guest in today's episode. And of course, while Trump himself is such a consummate showman, acting out so much of his daily governance as though it's an episode of The Apprentice, that's something I discussed with Alex, I'm interested not only in how the optics of the Trump administration are being understood by the public, but also by policymakers and people with the power to make decisions. Because the optics have a real-world effect. People respond to them and take decisions on the basis of those words. Germany is an intriguing example of a country that really seems as though it wants to make major policy changes as a direct result of Trump's words. And so we'll hear in this episode from the Financial Times' Berlin correspondent Laura Pitel about how Europe's biggest economy is navigating the waters around Storm Trump. Finally, perhaps because Trump is such a dominant figure, I think we tend to focus almost all our attention on him. And so I wanted to take a step back and consider what those around Trump are thinking, because the optics and their effects are part of a set of competing ideologies from the people who surround him. So we're going to hear from my colleague Danny Postel, New Lines' politics editor, who is in the process of both writing and commissioning a couple of pieces for the magazine about these various competing ideologies that are battling for supremacy behind their figurehead. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. You can find Alex Hobson's New Lines essay linked in the show notes. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. So as I say, we are interested in the optics of this new Trump administration. And in the essay that you wrote for us called "The Humiliation is the Point," you wrote about how the humiliation is so much a part of the way that Trump does business. And I was thinking in particular of three incidents that have happened in the past few weeks. The Zelensky White House shakedown is the main one. But the two others, which I think we should come to, are J.D. Vance in Europe speaking extremely rudely to American allies, and then Trump saying positive things about Vladimir Putin at a time when the Europeans feel that this is their adversary on the continent. So we should take them one at a time, but let's start with the Zelensky shakedown, which I think probably is the apex of your argument that Trump operates as a humiliation entrepreneur.
Yeah, and my focus was on the style of humiliation that Trump uses here, and the way that is inextricable from the political dimension as well as the strategic dimension, that you can't really separate these things.
You don't, meaning you think that you don't just think he does it because that's how he is. You think it's very deliberately political.
Well, I think that I don't think we can even separate that. I mean, because right. His consciousness is up for exploration. I think that it's a strategy that is deliberate. It's the way he does business. And if you look at how he operates in many instances, since he's returned to the presidency, he uses these techniques. And I think what made this stand out so much is that, in my view, this was the first time that he had been challenged by a foreign leader in the setting of the Oval Office in the way that he was. And so I think that the imperative for him to put Zelensky in his place in a public way was very important, and I think inextricable from his larger shift, the larger policy shift that he's interested in, that he sees bringing Zelensky down, so to speak, and kind of lowering Zelensky's pretensions as being necessary. I think a necessary component of this broader policy shift that he's interested in with respect to Russia and Europe.
And to some degree, you think that the policy comes secondary. He's much more interested in the optics of the humiliation, in bringing Zelensky down a peg or two, because he had said, I think he said it there in the Oval Office, but he certainly said it subsequently, that he feels that Zelensky has had an easy ride with other allies, that he's been going around the world for the last couple of years and trying to get support and military aid and so on. And almost you sometimes feel that Trump respects him as a showman, but is kind of upset that he gets so much from allies.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think the degree of kind of bitterness about Zelensky's relationship with Biden and the previous administration came out in the meeting as well, when Vance mentioned that Zelensky had been at a campaign rally with Trump's opponent, despite all that Trump had done for Ukraine.
Right.
So these sort of, all of these kind of, I'd call them grievances of different kinds, were combined and came to the fore in this meeting. And I think that that's part of the Trump style, that the personal grievances are completely linked together with larger national interest and kind of grand strategy concerns. They're linked together in kind of a seamless way, and so you can transition very quickly from what Zelensky did at a campaign rally to potentially ending U.S. support for Ukraine entirely.
Well, that's one of the things I think that's so interesting about this new Trump 2.0, is that sometimes Trump appears to have an impression of himself as embodying America as a country. So he will express it as, Zelensky, you are not respecting us as a country enough. But he really means you're not respecting me enough.
Right. He sees these things as inseparable. And I did dwell a little bit on, at the very pinnacle of this event, what draws Trump into this, what I call a tag team against Zelensky, is that Zelensky says something about Russia and the U.S. feeling the influence of Russia soon enough. And Trump picks up on that word feel, and he immediately shifts and says, you don't get to dictate what we feel. We will feel strong. So I think there's an expression of a kind of emotional sovereignty and power that Trump embodies it himself. And so I think he sees his ability to feel strong and feel powerful is inseparable from the United States as an autonomous and most powerful nation.
That's super interesting because, as you say, Zelensky's point, because Zelensky is, he's speaking in his second or third language, and he's trying to get a word in edgewise with so many people watching. Really, his point was that maybe the Americans, protected by these two large oceans, will not yet feel the problems with Russia, but in time it will reach their shores, whether it does so politically or militarily. But somehow Trump didn't try to understand what he meant. He just immediately almost didn't hear the word feel. He felt the word feel.
Right. He felt the word feel. And there he immediately had to demonstrate that he determined how he felt, and in the sense that he will determine how
America feels. Right.
Yeah. And I think that there's a shift in the emotional tone with Trump that is, I think, one of the main aims. And again, we don't know how deliberate this is. But even in you mentioned Vance's speech at Munich. Even Vance used this expression, we will not be told how to feel to Europeans. And so I think that there's a sense that in order to make these radical shifts that Trump apparently seems to be interested in U.S. relations with the world, there has to be a corresponding radical shift in in what Americans feel about their allies, about other nations, and in sort of where their emotional allegiances are. And it seems that Trump is trying to recenter this into a very insular emotional world.
How much of this do you think is instinctive to Trump? Because when you think about, at the very end of that Zelensky meeting, he said, "Oh, this is going to be great television." And that was kind of like almost like a meta moment where he seems to be stepping out of that particular confrontation and realizing, well, this is what it will play like on television. I imagine you don't think that Trump did all of that deliberately. You think it's instinctive. But on some level, he understands that there's a game of optics being played.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is a showman, and he, of course, and I mentioned that if you look at the encounter with Zelensky and you kind of follow the arc of it, it tracks very closely with the arc of an episode of The Apprentice, and even to the point where the endings, you see Zelensky leaving the White House, unceremoniously in the manner of a contestant on The Apprentice who's been fired by Trump in the boardroom. And even the figure of Vance in that encounter, stepping in as a kind of intermediary that is able to sort of set the stage for Trump. And this is also similar. But I think to get back to your question, I think this is instinctive to Trump. Trump is very aware of how things look. And I think he works within the televisual medium. That's his comfort zone is there. So it's interesting as well that this was done publicly, not behind closed doors, that Trump allowed for this to occur live in front of a global audience. And I think, his instincts are very linked to the medium of reality television. And he claimed that he let it go on because he knew that this was sort of salutary for the audiences to see this on live television. And so I think this is how he imagines the exercise of power in its kind of most condensed form, is that you express it through these kinds of performative moments.
That's very interesting. How much do you think does this humiliation work, even the threat of the humiliation? Because sometimes you think with him, there's a volatility and an unpredictability about him. But actually, sometimes that seems to bear fruit. I mean, we are now in the middle, potentially, of a 30-day ceasefire, which I don't think Zelensky would have agreed to if that stage-managed moment in the Oval Office hadn't happened.
Right. I mean, it's very early, but I think I agree. There are those who claim that Trump has sort of mastered the madman style.
Yeah, right.
But the interesting thing is that he's mastered it mostly in his relations with allies, not with adversaries.
That's interesting.
So I think he's been able to sort of refract some of these strategies for use in all these different contexts with allies, with clients, with friends, with people in his own cabinet. He's able to use these kinds of tools that are usually, traditionally in U.S. diplomatic history, are usually oriented towards adversaries. But I think it's true that we have to look at what has happened since this meeting as not necessarily a vindication of Trump's approach, but at least that humiliation was all part of a larger purpose, which was to coerce Zelensky and the Ukrainians to agree to a ceasefire and to agree to Trump's terms, or to at least, to express that Trump could make these kinds of policy shifts. And so I think that these things cannot really be separated. And at this point, at this early point, you can make the argument that this did have an effect, and it was what Trump intended.
What do you think is the long-term problem of behaving that way? A country with so much military power like the US can do these spectacles and get away with them because people will respond and try to placate the madman in the Oval Office just so that there are not problems, so that Canada doesn't get invaded and tariffs are not slapped on you and things like that. How long do you think you can go on behaving like that?
I think that conceivably, Trump could go on behaving like this for a very long time. But I think the second and third order effects of this, even on the global system as a whole, are unclear because in these instances, Trump can perhaps compel allies to behave the way he wants, or to at least show a kind of subservience. But we can already see that this one event seems to have set in motion all sorts of other responses in Europe and elsewhere that certainly over time could lead to just a major reorientation. And it seems that that's what Trump wants in a certain respect, is to redefine U.S. relations with the world. And he sees the emergence of a new order, which he is sort of shepherding in part through these kinds of performances. But I think we don't know. It's so early. We don't, in the second term, we don't know. But if we look at the first term, it doesn't, it's these, all of his antics like this didn't necessarily lead to successful outcomes. If you look at from North Korea to Iran, wherever you look, I mean, the dangers are great, the risks are great, and it's very unclear that you can claim any sort of success, even in the short term.
Alex Hobson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Alex Hobson. While I think understanding the optics around what Trump is saying is so important, it would be a mistake to focus solely on those optics. Just because much of what comes out of the White House appears to be intended as theater, as entertainment, those words still carry real consequences. This week, Trump promised to escalate a worsening trade war with one of the United States' biggest trading partners, the EU. And quite aside from the markets, the transatlantic alliance that linked Western Europe and North America throughout the Cold War is now collapsing. All of a sudden, European states are coming to the realization that they can't rely on Washington to back up their security, at least not while Trump is in charge. And they're taking action. Defense spending is ballooning. Poland is planning military training for all its male citizens. So the knock-on consequences are very real. To get a sense of how it feels at the heart of Europe right now, I spoke to the Financial Times' Berlin correspondent, Laura Pitel. Laura's been right at the forefront of reporting some of these huge changes currently sweeping German politics, and has great insight into how Trump's words have echoed across the Atlantic. Laura Pitel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, as I was saying to you beforehand, the interesting part of this story is not merely the optics of the way the Trump administration behaves. It's that those optics then have a real knock-on consequence in Europe. And so, in particular, I was thinking about, well, the Zelensky shakedown, as we've called it, but also the way that Vance spoke when he came to Europe. How were those words heard across the Atlantic?
I was at the Munich Security Conference where he made that speech, and I think people were just shell-shocked. People were reeling. You know, they knew what Trump thought about Europe and defense spending and NATO and Russia, Ukraine, but they did not expect the US vice president to come to this conference, which has been like a decades-long gathering of people from both sides of the transatlantic alliance, and come and stand there on the podium and insult their democracies, you know, make false claims about freedom of expression and freedom of association in Europe, and to basically openly side with the far right alternative for Germany, like days before a German election, and then go and meet the party's leader. I mean, people were stunned.
And meet the party's leader.
Yeah, people were stunned.
That's why, I mean, there's so much to unpick, but just about that, about meeting AfD, that this is like the Trump administration actively involving itself in the politics of its allies.
Yeah. Yeah, it was
unprecedented. Yeah, extraordinary, right?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in the past, you know, you could say that there had been sort of tacit support for like the mainstream and stuff, but you know, AfD is very much not the mainstream. They are way, way outside of that, and you know, off the charts. And it came at a time when, you know, the mainstream parties are just so worried about their rise and what they stood for. It was a very extraordinary thing to do.
And for listeners, in German politics, they try not to involve the AfD. They try to keep this cordon sanitaire between like the moderate political parties and this group. So it wasn't, for the American audience, it wasn't merely that Vance was meeting an opposition figure. He was meeting someone that even the moderate politicians refused to meet.
He was breaking a taboo, and he was telling the Germans that they should also break the taboo and stop creating this firewall around the party.
So let's come to some of these comments from Vance and also the Zelensky-Trump interview. Because as I was saying, like the interesting part is that the Europeans are not waiting to see if these words will then lead to consequences. They're immediately changing. I mean, they've approved this 800 billion defense spending. The Germans are thinking very seriously about a nuclear umbrella from France and the UK. Poland has this military service they want to give to every young man. Like real changes are happening just in a matter of weeks, just on the back of words.
Yeah, I think at the beginning there was wait and see, before Trump actually took office, because in many ways what he's doing is not a massive surprise. But I think the fact that he is now doing it somehow is still a shock and a surprise. But now that it's happening, people are responding very, very fast. And so we had elections at the end of February in Germany, and the election winner, the Christian Democrat leader Friedrich Merz, basically straight off the bat that night, after an hour or two after being elected, came out with some very strong comments about how Germany and Europe needed to make itself independent from the US, which is language that, is pretty out there for somebody who deeply values the US, Germany and US-Europe relationship. And he's kind of carried on in that vein in the weeks since. He's not yet chancellor. He's still in the process of conducting coalition negotiations. But as part of that, he's come up with this huge and really quite radical proposal of tearing up Germany's rules on borrowing. Germans are very strict about borrowing, and they like to go around telling other Europeans that they mustn't borrow too much. They've got to stick within strict rules and be very fiscally prudent. But Merz has decided that there should be no limit on borrowing for defense spending in Germany. And at the same time, he's also announced a 500 billion fund for infrastructure. So basically, economists say the country could borrow basically $1 trillion over the course of the next 10 years to fund these projects. And that is huge. That's a sea change.
And isn't it astonishing, and again, particularly for the American listeners, that the Europeans are now applauding the rearming of Germany? Something that within living memory would have been seen as something extraordinary.
Totally. And I think Germans are still kind of tiptoeing their way around this or getting used to the idea, because it's just a deep part of the kind of post-war German psyche, the German narrative that people hear that tell themselves that Germany should not be a leader on the world stage, on the European stage. It should not be a great military power. Germany should follow the lead of others. They take very seriously learning those lessons. But at the same time, people in Europe have been asking Germany to step up. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the outgoing Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was that he didn't take enough of a leadership role. And, Friedrich Merz, he's controversial in many ways, but I think he has shown a real interest in improving that European relationship. He said that. And I think this first step, 10 days or so after being elected, of this massive financial package is another indicator of that. He wants to be a German leader who's going to do something in Europe at this just momentous time.
And tell me, why do you think in Germany, but also, let's say, across Europe, why do you think the leaders don't just take it as bluster? Because one of the things that I find fascinating about this, the sea change that is happening in Europe in terms of rearmament, is that Trump is, even if Trump does the maximum, which is withdraw from NATO, he's only going to be there for the next 3.5 years. And whoever comes in afterwards will almost certainly take America back into NATO. So why are they not taking it as bluster and saying, okay, we'll just sit out the next 3.5 years?
I think there's been a kind of fundamental breach in the trust. For decades, their whole security architecture was built on the idea that it was backed up by the US. And if you take the nuclear deterrent, Trump hasn't actually said that he's going to withdraw this extended nuclear deterrent from Europe. He hasn't said that. But Europeans are now, they're kind of trying to keep a step ahead of him now, actually, because I think they're worried that could happen. And that's why you have these extraordinary comments from Merz that he would like to seek kind of nuclear protection from France and the UK. And I hear people in the analyst world saying now that it's not actually unthinkable that Germany could become a nuclear power, because if for whatever reason the idea of sharing with France and Britain, it's quite complicated actually extending French-British nuclear deterrent to Germany and the rest of Europe. If that doesn't work, maybe Germany has to take the next step and get its own nukes, which would be, again, another huge reversal of the entire post-war European order.
The reason I keep coming back to this topic is that I think for American listeners, I think it's so important to understand the astonishing part of it. There are people in Germany today who were alive when they fought a war with Britain and invaded France. And now they are talking about having a nuclear umbrella from those two countries protecting the Germans from the Russians.
I mean, it's quite good for the project of European unity, right? And pretty good for the UK's kind of post-Brexit role in Europe. Suddenly it's relevant again. It's very interesting, how Trump's changing all of these dynamics.
We had the historian Katja Hoyer on the podcast at the end of last year, and we spoke to her about how Germany now feels so much more vulnerable than either France or the UK, just simply because, not merely because they don't have nuclear weapons, but they feel so much more vulnerable because of the geographic reality. Like they're just right there. Russia is right there next to them. So let's think about it from the German perspective, and then let's think about it from let's say, the wider European perspective. So I'm thinking about Britain and France and Spain, which are a little bit further away from Russia. If the Germans feel this frightened, concerned, anxious about Russia, do you think that the argument of the Merkel years that said maybe we should just make peace with our neighbor and we have pipelines and so on, do you think that has just been completely thrown to the side now? We're not going back to that.
No, I don't think I can say that either, because I think the view that we're talking about is the view of a part of Germany, and it's the kind of German establishment, definitely that of Friedrich Merz, the next chancellor, a part of the Social Democrats who are also likely to be in government with him. But then at the same time, you have this large streak in Germany that still is, what they call Russia understanders, people who have some sympathy. I mean, look at the election results where the AfD, which calls for the end of sanctions on Moscow and the resumption of trade with Moscow, they won a record 21% of the results. In East Germany, they got quite close to 50% in some places. You look at young people who voted, almost half of young people voted for either the far left or the far right. We at the FT did a story recently about Nord Stream and some discussions that are taking place between people close to Putin and businessmen in the US about potentially buying parts of the Nord Stream infrastructure. And I had really interesting conversations here around that. And a lot of people said it's unthinkable that Germany could buy Russian gas again. Germany used to be the biggest buyer in Europe of Russian gas. But I did encounter one or two people in the world of officialdom who said it wasn't unthinkable. It would be a business transaction, that it could help Germany to diversify its energy sources. And that blew my mind, because I thought, well, it's just like being in a time warp going back to the kind of Merkel era. So I think it's complicated.
They could still, for example, if Trump makes this big deal with Russia, which looks like it looks much more likely than it did 2 weeks ago, and tries to make some sort of grand deal, the sanctions are lifted, investment starts again, you can imagine that parts of the German political establishment will take that political cover and say, okay, let's go back to the Merkel years and try to have an economic relationship with Russia.
Yeah, definitely. Parts of German business would want that. They would want the Russian gas to flow again. I don't know how feasible, either kind of commercially or politically, that really is. But there are definitely people in this country who would advocate it. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. On the one hand, you have this talk about being ready for war and needing to massively rearm and to increase recruitment to the armed forces. But then there are strong currents that also run through this country that pull in different directions.
You said something earlier about Britain and about now they suddenly seem to think that they can find a role post-Brexit. And I wonder how much of the sudden warmongering on the part of the Europeans, how much of that has to do with political opportunity. With Ursula von der Leyen thinking to herself, well, at some point she would also like to go back into German politics. And it's probably a good look to be the person saying we have to rearm, we're not doing enough. The same with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, if he's seeking a role on the European stage or on the world stage, there's no better role than the person beating the drums of war, because it puts you in a very strong political position. So how far do you read those steps as being political opportunity versus really believing that the US might retreat and European security has to be in the hands of Europeans?
No, because I think to unpick the question, you have to think about how popular it is to beat the drum of war. And I find myself thinking a lot, as a Brit in Germany, thinking about the comparison, because I think that in the UK, there has been a lot less public debate and hand-wringing about sending weapons to Ukraine. As far as I can tell, I haven't lived there for a while, but as far as I can tell, there's not very much public disagreement about supporting Ukraine. It seems to be broadly public consensus that that's what should happen. Whereas here in Germany, I think it's a lot more fraught. And for example, during the election campaign, you saw Olaf Scholz trying to tread that line very carefully and really not wanting to be too hawkish in his support for Ukraine. So there has been this big ongoing row for more than a year, I guess 2 years, about whether or not Germany should send long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. And Friedrich Merz used to be very plainly in favor of that. And he walked it back and he got much more cautious because the public is nervous. And I think it's partly about the physical proximity that you were mentioning. You know, people do feel closer to Russia here in Berlin than you maybe do in London, Paris, or Madrid. And then there's also the complicated history. There's the history of wars dating back hundreds of years, but also more recently with the German Democratic Republic, you know, until 1989, like that was a Soviet satellite state that was right here, you know, a whole swathe of the country. People grew up speaking Russian, at least older generations. They feel some connection. There's also the concerns about German history in World War II and the huge casualties inflicted on the Soviets by the Nazis. So there's a lot of layers of different emotions and histories. And so I'm not totally convinced that in Germany it necessarily plays well to be like a very staunchly pro-war politician. In fact, I think they have to tread a careful line.
Your colleague Simon Cooper wrote in the FT last weekend about the return of two Europes, and he was saying that some of the states in Europe feel much more vulnerable because of this aggressive Russia, and he's thinking in particular of the Baltic states. And so I think it relates to what you were talking about, that some of the major powers are not certain what they think about Russia moving forward. And maybe this idea that there is a united front with Europe is probably something that could easily fall apart, very easily, actually.
Yeah, I mean, we already have like the likes of Hungary that clearly do not share the view of like von der Leyen and others who are pushing for Europe to be very tough on Moscow. But even, you know, you see it, for example, with this discussion about the coalition of the willing, of who would be willing to send troops to police a potential ceasefire. And, you know, me and my colleagues like to laugh, there's also a coalition of the unwilling of countries that are really not very keen, and Germany is among them. And they all have their different reasons, but there are limits to what someone wants to do, and that's constantly straining European unity. It also happens on spending, how to raise money for defense, on what to do with frozen Russian assets. You know, they're trying to put on a show of unity, but it doesn't often in reality doesn't work out that way.
Laura Pitel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Laura Pitel in Berlin. The rearming of Europe is perhaps the most noticeable and significant change of the first few weeks of the Trump administration. As we said in the conversation with Laura, the optics and the language of the first few weeks have spurred countries to act, not waiting to see whether those words will be followed by actions. But underlying all of what is coming out of the White House is the emerging ideology of Trump 2.0. I say emerging because I don't think Trump's ideology this time around is all that fully formed. And anyway, I think it will be formed in contestation with other people on his team and the events of the wider world. There are competing ideologies within the Trump administration, and it's still a debate, just weeks into the presidency, about which person and which ideology will win out. This is something our politics editor Danny Postel has thought a lot about, and I spoke to him to understand what some of these competing ideologies are and how they may play out in the next few years. First of all, Danny Postel, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be back, Faisal.
You are writing an essay for us about two ideologies that, in your opinion, sit at the very heart of this new Trump administration. And you've explained those two ideologies as America First and Vanceism. And I want to outline for the audience what they are, using the concrete example of the Ukraine war, although obviously Vanceism and America First applies more broadly. America First a slogan, also an ideology, is something that is very deeply rooted in Trump's mind. He seems at first to be a classic isolationist, unwilling to get involved in wars and problems beyond America's shores. I wrote, and we were talking about this before, it's hard to think of a single conflict of the past few years of which he would approve. Now, you pointed out that he was in favor of attacking ISIS. But my argument would be, well, that was a war that was handed to him, and perhaps he wouldn't have been interested in starting it.
Tough to say with that particular example, because the things that he said about it on the campaign trail in 2015 and 16 were quite belligerent. Like, I would bomb the shit out of them. I would kill those suckers. You know, that was sort of there was a very broad consensus about the fight against ISIS. Very few people on the political spectrum in the United States opposed that particular military campaign. It wasn't even seen as a war particularly, because the Islamic State, despite calling itself a state, was really not, it wasn't exactly a traditional war. It was more of a military operation.
Agreed. But if we're talking about Trump in terms of being a classic isolationist, he didn't like the Iraq war. He didn't like the Afghan war. He says neither the Gaza war nor the Ukraine war would have started had he been in power. This, I think, you can put in the context of America First nationalism. If that is the ideology of Trump, it is absolutely not the ideology that you believe J.D. Vance subscribes to.
Well, I think explicitly J.D. Vance does subscribe to it. In other words, he frames his position on various foreign policy issues as advancing U.S. strategic interests, what's best for the United States. So, for example, in the case of the Ukraine-Russia war, he would have us believe that his position is very much that of the realists, which is, we don't take sides. We're not interested in picking a side in wars or conflicts, and even less so in the internal politics of other countries. We're simply looking out for what's in America's best interest. And in the case of Ukraine, the argument goes, supporting Ukraine in this basically hopeless fight against its much larger and more powerful adversary, Russia, is really a ticket to nowhere. And it would be a forever war, and we shouldn't be in the business of doing that. So that's the kind of officially stated position. But if you scratch beneath the surface, what you find is that Vance belongs to an ideological current of conservatism that has a very different view of these things. And I think the best way to approach it is by quoting something that Vance's friend, Tucker Carlson, they're very close ideologically, not just personal friends. Tucker Carlson said the following a few years ago, which I find revealing. He said, "Why do I care what's going on in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? And I'm serious, why do I care? Why shouldn't I root for Russia, which I am?" Now that's very interesting, isn't it? Notice how the Tucker Carlson quote itself is internally contradictory. So the first half, why do I care what's going on in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, expresses this America first or realist outlook. But the second half, why shouldn't I root for Russia, which I am, conveys something very different, which I'm suggesting is closer to the Vance outlook. But there's an obvious contradiction between these two things, because if you really don't care what happens in Ukraine, then why are you rooting for Russia? I would call this a Freudian slip on Carlson's part.
The importance of passing that distinction is because you think that there is strong ideology behind J.D. Vance. You think that when it comes to Ukraine, but also more broadly other places, you think that he has a particular view of the world which actually requires America to involve itself in the politics of other people's countries.
Yes, and that's very clear if you look at J.D. Vance's intellectual influences and the ideological waters he swims in. And it's not just Ukraine and Russia, by the way. Let's take Germany. Vance was not neutral about that country's recent elections. He met not with the country's chancellor, but rather with the leader of the far-right AfD when he was there a few weeks ago. It's perfectly clear that he feels an affinity with the AfD, and in his speech at the Munich Security Conference, he chastised European leaders not for their position on international affairs, but their domestic politics, issues of free speech, censoring and marginalizing parties that they, like the AfD, that they consider beyond the pale. So this isn't neutrality. Now, and this is not inconsistent. It's not just a Vance idiosyncrasy. The Trump administration has been courting and promoting far-right populist parties across Europe. And it's interesting that something that the Bulgarian writer Ivan Krastev noted recently stands out to me. He makes the point that when Vance and Trump chastise other countries over their internal affairs like this, it's only democracies they take to task, never authoritarian regimes like Putin's Russia. They never criticize Putin or Xi for their repression or human rights violations at home. It's only democratic countries.
What do you interpret that to mean?
Well, I think that there is a stronger affinity in the Vance-Trump worldview for authoritarian regimes. Now, in the case of Trump, it's more vulgar. It's just he likes strong men. He likes the aesthetics and the sort of personality of the strong man. He identifies with a Putin, with strong leaders who don't have to worry about, messy things like civil liberties and elections and things like that. With Vance, it goes much, much deeper. And there's a whole history of pro-Putin sentiment among the currents of right-wing ideology that Vance identifies with. So let's take Pat Buchanan, a very, very important figure in American politics. In fact, Trump got the slogan "America First" from Pat Buchanan. That was the slogan of Buchanan's own presidential campaign in 2000. Now, Buchanan didn't coin it. It actually goes back further, and there was an America First committee in 1940. But Buchanan was a direct influence on Trump. And Buchanan wrote this essay some years ago arguing that Putin was one of us, quote unquote, by which he meant a paleo-conservative. This is the particular brand of conservatism that Buchanan is known as sort of having designed. He's the intellectual godfather in many ways of this paleo-conservative worldview, which has to do with culture wars. In other words, why do they identify paleo-conservatives? Why would they identify with someone like Putin? Because they see Putin as a culture warrior, someone waging war against liberalism, against immigration, against globalism, and defending Christendom.
And for the audience, why do they call themselves paleo-conservatives?
Because they want to bring, it's a way of identifying that current against neoconservatism, which they saw as a universalist, sort of rootless, cosmopolitan, bloodless form of conservatism that was about ideas rather than traditions. Paleo-conservatives very much emphasize the need for community, religion, tradition, family. They tend to be very anti-immigrant because they see nations as ethno-nationalist, in ethno-nationalist terms, right? Like, so the idea of uncontrolled immigration, it poisons the blood, if you will, or changes the composition and cultural identity of a country. So they look up to people like Viktor Orban and Putin, who share this view and who, in their eyes, defend Christendom against gender ideology, against feminists, against migration and wokeism and things like that.
And why this is interesting is because we're really talking about the conception that Trump and Vance have about the role of the state and what the state should and shouldn't do. And interestingly, with Pat Buchanan and with the paleo-conservatives, they have a sense that the state needs to do more to push the society in the particular direction that they want it to go in. If you extrapolate that out to foreign policy, that is a very unrealistic position. That is a position, very much like we were saying about J.D. Vance, where you actively go out and try to reshape other people's societies. The reason why the AFD example really matters, and this is something we talked about with Laura Pitel of the FT, the reason why Vance meeting the AFD's leader is because it broke a taboo on meeting these far-right leaders. So Vance, I don't think Vance is necessarily a paleo-conservative in the way that Trump is, but Vance absolutely believes that the state, the American state, has a role in reshaping the societies of other countries, not merely its own society.
Well, at the very least, he believes that the American state has allies in the world. And in the case of, this culture war that is roiling Europe, he sees his side as the side of the far-right populists and of Orban and of Putin. And this isn't just Vance. I mean, the entire CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, has teamed up with Orban and held its annual event in Budapest and invited Orban to be a keynote speaker at the US version of the event. So there's a deep affinity between far-right populist movements, parties, and leaders across the world. Steve Bannon is an important figure in all of this. He's been going around the world for the last several years, forging alliances with far-right movements and parties, not only in Europe, but, famously in the case of Brazil, forging a deep relationship with Jair Bolsonaro, the former president, and perhaps one day future president. So it's ironic because these people are nationalists and they're against globalism, but they've forged this kind of right-wing international or reactionary international, if you will.
Yeah. So this is what I think it's important to pull out for the audience, that we're really talking about these competing ideologies within the broader Trump camp. And as much as you address some of these questions in your forthcoming essay, we also have another forthcoming essay by the writer Alexander Reed Ross, who is addressing some of these similar issues, talking about the civil war inside the Republican Party. Now, as he describes it, the GOP is split. Now, this is the party, not the Trump administration. The party is split along two lines. And you've already outlined one of them. This is the Steve Bannon traditionalists. And on the other hand, you have what he calls the Elon Musk technocrats. And he thinks that there's a battle line that's being drawn between these two. The traditionalists are more committed to, you might think of it like the values of the Republican Party. They're more interested perhaps in the religious aspects of the party, the moral aspects of the party, the idea that it is a certain type of person that this conservatism engenders. And then separately, the technocrats, the Elon Musk technocrats, they seem less interested in the moral aspects. They seem much more interested in the economic aspects.
Yes, although sometimes those lines get blurred. So, for example, Musk is very concerned with natalism, right? He has this obsession with our declining birth rate and demographic collapse. This is something J.D. Vance shares, this idea that basically our societies, particularly in the United States, but also in other countries in Europe, for example, they're not reproducing themselves. And so this is one of the arguments that justifies letting in more migrants, right? Our population is going to decline if we don't let in more migrants. Well, their answer is, well, then native-born people or U.S. citizens need to have more babies of their own. So you're right that Musk is definitely more focused on these sort of economic dimensions of, if you will, slash, for example, with his Doge rampage that he's on, it seems to be about slashing budgets and austerity measures and saving money for the federal government. But is it really? Because if it were, there would be much more emphasis, for example, on, not going for these huge tax cuts for the rich. That would save that's a huge waste of money. A lot of it seems to be actually a culture war, being driven by culture war concerns and targeting government agencies that their side perceives as being on the wrong side of the culture wars, advancing wokeism, etc.
Well, this is why I think that this conversation is so interesting, because you have different lines of ideologies, and some of the people involved, like Musk, they're not even very good Republicans. Musk is an odd figure in that sense. You talk about he believes that there's a crisis of demography. He's trying to solve it single-handedly. He has more than a dozen children. But he's morally unconventional in that sense. To most Republicans, to most conservative Republicans, he is an unusual, unconventional figure. He has a dozen children by, I actually don't know how many different women, but several different women, most of whom he's never lived in a traditional family unit with. And I think that is something that, if you contrast it with the kind of blue-collar conservatives that Bannon might represent, that's a very unusual figure for them to rally around.
Yes, and it's not just the individual lifestyle, let's say, or biography of Musk. It's actually the policies that he's pursuing with this symbolic chainsaw that he's taking to the federal budget and the bureaucracy. This is, on the one hand, this appeals to a much more traditional business class, country club Republican, the budget hawks, the austerity Republicans. But actually, it's, as Steve Bannon has warned, this is dangerous. He's actually going after, in some ways, the heartland of MAGA. Bannon recently said on his podcast, be careful going after Medicaid. There's a lot of MAGA on Medicaid. They're going after veterans benefits, services for veterans. A lot of them, these are these are a lot of Trump's constituents. A lot of these people voted for Trump, and Elon Musk is taking a chainsaw to their benefits. In fact, Red America disproportionately receives some form of government assistance. So there's a sense in which there's going to be more anger. Bannon is warning Trump, if you let Musk loose and don't rein him in, and if you let him take that chainsaw to some of these programs, there's going to be a huge backlash in middle America, working class America, poor communities, rural communities, small towns, because this is not what they signed up for. It's not what they voted for. It's not what Trump ran on.
And this, to wrap it up, puts Trump in a position that he seems to enjoy, which is being at the center of a court of multiple opinions. And he likes to be in that position where he has a confrontational attitude between different people on the team, and he is the person in the middle, the king in the court, making decisions. But there's also dangers as you move forward. We're only a few weeks in, because he needs to keep the base happy. That's what Bannon is talking about. And he also needs to keep the public broadly happy. He has to try to find a way through this MAGA civil war.
He does, although that's a bit less the case in this administration than the first go, because he's, well, at least as far as we know, he's not running for re-election. He's not allowed to constitutionally. So assuming that there isn't some state of exception to that, which is by no means airtight, but let's say for the sake of argument, this is it. This is a hard stop at the end of this administration. Trump doesn't actually have to run again. He doesn't have to convince people, but he does love being popular. He's obsessed with opinion polls and his favorability ratings and so forth. He doesn't want to be unpopular. He doesn't want to upset Wall Street too much, although he is doing so with his tariff wars. I think that he is very aware of the tension in this growing MAGA civil war between Bannon and Musk. He feels the heat of that. He's trying to mediate and have it both ways, but push is coming to shove, and something has to give at some point. But you're exactly right that he holds the cards in the end. He's very fond of reminding people that he is the one who holds the cards, and he can fire Musk. He can let him go in a heartbeat, if need be. I mean, Bannon knows this well, because Bannon was his senior advisor and in the first go, and he got fired. So at the end of the day, there are these various forces around. I mean, J.D. Vance is the vice president. I think that was very significant that Trump picked him, because in the first administration, there was a kind of team of rivals, to harken back to Lincoln's cabinet. There were disagreements. There were more traditional conservatives, Republicans, and then more Trumpy ones. This time around, it's much more Trumpy all around. There aren't as many old school adults in the room or Republican establishment types. It's much more MAGA. And that's why J.D. Vance is so significant in my view. He's the ideologue of this administration, of Trump 2.0, and possibly its future.
And I think that's the reason, really, that we're talking about these ideologies, because you're right, of course, they don't have the traditional Republicans who would have been surrounding George W. Bush. It's much more a new set of ideas, but it is multiple sets of ideas. Even though these people seem more loyal to Trump, they do have their own ideologies that they are promoting. And Trump, with that metaphor, like the king in the court, is to quote George W. Bush again, the decider.
Yes, Trump is the decider. And, even people who were traditional Republicans like Marco Rubio, now he's there in the court as our Secretary of State, basically our foreign minister, but he has become Trumpified, right? So we know that his views on Russia and Ukraine, just as recently as a few months ago, were quite different from the Trump-Vance administration's line, but he has to toe that line. So there are tensions, but at the end of the day, Trump is a particularly strong leader. He wouldn't have people around him if he didn't feel that they were loyal to him. That's the key, right? The loyalty test. This is the fundamental make or break issue for Trump, and how he has decided to shape this 2.0 administration of his.
Danny Postel, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Danny Postel there in Chicago. I like this metaphor of Trump as a king in a court, because I think it explains the way the next few years may play out. Even though, as Danny says, the people around Trump are more loyal to him this time, they still have differing views and ideas. And it's not entirely obvious what the overall trajectory will be. Political leaders always have to deal with the political events that are thrown at them, but they often draw on a deeper ideological bedrock. They have a set of ideas that they believe in because most of them spent years in a political party. That, to wrap it back to the start of this podcast where I said Trump doesn't follow established rules, is not Trump's background. And I think away from the bluster and even violence of the language, there's a real difference in the way Trump will think about politics in the coming years. You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. You can find Alex Hobson's essay, The Humiliation is the Point, linked in the episode's show notes. The essays we discussed by Danny Postel and Alexander Reed Ross will be published in the coming weeks. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.